to be having her here today, and I know she'll do a bit of introduction to her own background and her own purpose once we get going. Can you go to the next slide, please? We're bringing this event to the region as a gift to the region from SWR, and we're not asking for any funds to cover the cost for this. We think it's an important piece. However, if you do feel you would like to contribute to moving this forward, we have enabled something on the Eventbrite page to give donations to charities to help to show people where to do that. So as you're seeing on your screen right now, you can give a donation and donate exactly right there to help with the African Community Wellness Initiative. Larissa will speak to them a little bit. So without further ado, I will turn it over to the person we're all here to learn from and listen to, Larissa Crawford. It is so wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for that opening, Tova, and for bringing us in to really share space with you and your community. So tasik ya metin Larissa Crawford dishne kashun Calgary ni weekend pini fami Jamaica ni weekend. Bonjour, bon matin, je m'appelle Larissa Crawford. Hello, good morning, my name is Larissa Crawford. I just introduced myself in acknowledging my Métis ancestry from Penetang, Ontario, and my Afro-Caribbean ancestry from Jamaica, which I both passed down to my 3-year-old daughter, Zaira. And I'm calling in from the traditional territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina Nation, the Stori Nakoda Nation, in Métis homelands, Region 3. And I think this is important to acknowledge, especially because everything that I speak to and my approach to doing anti-racism work with a restorative practice lens is very much informed by the teachings I've received and my connections to the original caregivers of the lands on which I live on. So I've grown up here and I have deep connections to the Blackfoot teachings and communities, and that's what I was brought up with. But then also I lived in Toronto for about 6 years, and so many of my perspectives are also shaped by Anishinaabeg knowledge and teachings. And I think this is important to acknowledge, especially as I've reflected on my relationship to the original caregivers and understanding my responsibilities to them. And that's where I'm going to open up with digital spaces. It's often difficult to hold land acknowledgements because we're all calling in from different places of the world and of these lands. And so as an organization, we like to open up our spaces in an online space with a statement of ancestry and ancestral accountability. So you'll see this quote: if you aren't immediately asking questions upon your arrival or of your ancestors' arrival on this land, you are on the land you are on, and about your role, history, and relationship to that land, then there needs to be some questions asked about how we perpetuate contemporary colonial erasure and violence. So what this quote says to me, and I think why it's so important to share, is to really reflect on this idea of ancestral accountability, this idea of looking at history, of looking at futures through the lens of ancestry, and understanding your own ancestors, their actions and inactions, and understanding the ancestors as the spaces we occupy. And when we look at history through a lens of ancestry, when we look at history in a way that personally connects us to those actions and inactions, we position ourselves in having to reflect on how did their actions and inactions, how did their systems, how did their decisions, how did their beliefs and ideologies inform the realities we experience today? What did we inherit in terms of the environment and our climate condition, in terms of behaviors, in terms of systems of repression? What are we inheriting? So in order to understand their impact on us, and in looking at their impact on us and how that happened, we're better able to position ourselves in understanding our actions and inactions and how we are creating realities for future generations as future ancestors. And so this approach to understanding climate work, sustainability work, and anti-racist work, this lens of ancestry helps us understand that in a more personal way, in a more concrete way, and to carry pride in this work, but then also to understand the responsibility of this work, and to understand that our actions and inactions are going to have consequences whether we choose to acknowledge those or not. And this is really in line, this idea of starting with ancestral accountability with restorative practices that I've been taught. And that first we need to acknowledge harm, and we need to take accountability for that harm in order to move forward in good ways. And I'll speak a bit about more to that when we get to the lens of anti-racism and how I believe this also follows a restorative practice. But for this moment, I really want to set this dialogue, I really want to set this space with the framing that we're doing this work with impact on future generations, and that we're doing this work with consequences. And we need to be aware of when those consequences are going to be more positive and when they're going to perhaps be more detrimental. And what are we wanting those next generations to inherit from us? So I spoke a bit to my teachings with restorative practices. So I'm a certified mediator and restorative circle keeper. And again, my connection to original caregivers of the land I've been on have really informed my approach to this work. In more professional settings, founder and managing director of Future Ancestor Services. Also, I carry experience working as an employee for the Ontario government, Anti-Racism Directorate, and the Ministry of Energy. And lots of other background. You saw the bio on the event page, so I'm not going to go too much more into myself. In terms of Future Ancestor Services, though, we're an Indigenous and Black-owned, youth-led professional services social enterprise. So we work with a collection of professionals who are under 30, which is interesting because so often youth don't have the opportunity to shape minds and to shape decisions at the levels that we've been able to access. And a big part of the reason why we've been able to access a lot of the spaces we've gotten into is because we leverage the power of intergenerational collaboration. We leverage the power of elders, of working with established experts, on bringing them into our contracts and our work. And in doing so, we're able to harness that generational power and knowledge. Now, everything we do, from community services to client services, first of all, centers community as our primary source of accountability. Second, everything we do seeks to advance climate justice and equity with the understanding that one cannot exist without the other. And we do so through the lenses of ancestral accountability and anti-racism. So talking about anti-racism later, just talked about ancestral accountability a little bit. We're working with over 100 clients right now, many of whom work in the environmental and sustainability sectors. We're working with the highest levels of our government at many different ministries, but then at provincial, municipal governments, and then with nonprofits, youth-led initiatives, universities, schools. We're working, arts communities, arts organizations. We're working with a lot of different kinds of people. And sustainability and equity are things that affect everyone. So it's been really interesting to see what does sustainability look like in other sectors. So a lot of what we present is going to be informed by how intersectional our clients are and how diverse they are. So for today, I just want a precursor. The structure of today really looks at presenting content, having a discussion that's relevant to that content. Presenting content, having a discussion that's relevant to that content. And in my presentation of content, I really want to highlight that my intent is to inspire and not impose. So this comes from a brilliant Cree scholar, Dwayne Donald. He's one of our family friends, and he really, his literature is brilliant. And this quote, I think, really speaks to what we're trying to do today, and that we're seeking to inspire a continued learning journey. We're seeking to inspire a commitment to understanding these realities, to understanding the realities of racism, the realities of systemic privileging within your own community. Because it's one thing to say it's their problem, it's another to recognize it's our problem. And this is what we want to really inspire and work throughout today. Now, in terms of some shared agreements with our engagement, I'm just going through this pretty quickly because I want to get into the content. But in terms of engaging in a remote setting, how we structure our engagement is very informed by psychology research and research about Zoom fatigue, online learning fatigue. And we try to make our spaces as accessible as possible. So during content presentation, I'll ask that your cameras are off, your videos are off, you're muted. And this is just to provide you all a break. You don't have to be watched all the time. You can really sit there, listen, and engage with the slides that we're sharing, and really take the time to reflect on this without feeling like you're being watched. The second piece is time of engagement. So this is going to be for our discussion questions. So how discussion questions work and how this goes about, especially because we're so many and we have a limited amount of time. What we're going to do is during time of engagement, I'm going to show the question, I'm going to explain the question, and then I'll ask that you please use the star feature in the chat. So have your chat open and use the star feature when you would like to speak. And I'll call on people. So I'll call on you as I see the stars pop up. I'll invite you to speak. I'll ask that to be considerate of others' time, to keep your response to about a minute. But to feel free to go over if you feel it's absolutely necessary. And that I'll go through the first 3 to 5 responses depending on our availability and time. I'll explain how you can also contribute beyond sharing in front of everyone. So at this time, cameras are on, microphones are off, and when I call on you to speak, just unmute. And when you're done, don't worry about trailing off. You can just push mute, and then we know you're done speaking. And then share and chat. So there's going to be instances where I'm going to ask you a question in the opening and closing to share your response to a question. And this, I'm not going to go over and read out loud to everyone, but it's going through the process of thinking of your response and sharing it with others so others can really reflect on that as well, is really important for the process of today in this facilitated dialogue. When you share, please speak clearly and slowly. If you are using a computer microphone, making sure you're close enough to the microphone that we can hear you. And then at this time, I will ask you to please rename yourself and to include your correct pronouns in the chat or in your Zoom. So I'm going to share my screen from my end so that you can see how I do this. So I see everyone's videos. There we go. I see everyone's videos. I'm going to go to this little 3 dots and I'm going to say rename. I'm going to make sure that my name is in here, so you can do your first name, your last name, whatever the case. And then I'm going to add my pronouns here. This helps me as a facilitator, and it helps others in the room ensure that we're honoring those pronouns. So if you could please do that.
Larissa, we couldn't see the screen where you did that. We see your slides, but not the Zoom line.
Can you see it yet?
Nope.
Oh, stop share. Let me try this. Stop share and share. Y'all should be able to see now. Can you see?
So I can see your mouse moving around, but I see the slides in Google Slides, not your Zoom page.
Okay. Well, then I'll just explain. You're going to want to, again, in your video, you'll see your video piece. And then above your video, if you hover over your own video, you'll see 3 little dots at the top of your video. You're going to click that, and you're going to choose rename. And in renaming yourself, I'll ask that you please include your correct pronouns.
You know, Larissa, you can take a screenshot and share that screenshot, maybe.
Typically, the screen sharing works. I don't know why it's not working right now.
Zoom would not allow the Zoom itself, I think, to be shared. That's what my understanding is.
All right. And if you're having troubles renaming yourself, just if you could include in the chat your correct pronouns, that would help me, and that just helps me make sure I'm identifying everyone correctly. Perfect. Thank you for all of that, everyone. And moving on, just before getting into the content piece and before continuing with some of the shared agreements, I just want to highlight continuing the discussion. So there's the recognition, and I'll explain this when we get to Brave Space, but there's a recognition that not everyone's going to be able to share in the video space, but that also some people won't feel comfortable sharing. And so I'm going to include in the chat this link. Thank you for sharing, Diego. If you're still having trouble changing your name, check out the screenshot Diego just sent. All right. So I just included in the chat a survey. So in this survey, you'll be able to contribute your responses in the survey as well. So this survey will be open until end of day tomorrow. So if you want to have it open now and say you're not comfortable sharing in front of the group, feel free to capture your response in this survey. And you can see all the terms in terms of how we'll use this after. So what we're really looking to get out of today, beyond this discussion, beyond this inspiration, are discussion points that are going to be contributed anonymously and that will be recorded and reported anonymously. But discussion points in a summary document that will be made publicly available to the community, again, in humanizing experiences, statistics, and realities in the Waterloo region. And so that's really what the summary document is really going to serve as. And so if you aren't comfortable sharing in the video, or if you haven't gotten a chance to do so, please open up that survey and follow along with us in writing your responses in there. Now, I hold Brave Spaces. I hold Brave Spaces in that we follow these principles outlined by a Brave Space approach. I like Brave Spaces because with safe spaces, safety looks so different to everyone. And safety can be conflated with comfort. And we can have uncomfortable discussions. And we're going to maybe have uncomfortable discussions today. And so I don't want to say it's a safe space because safety looks so different to everyone. But when I say I'm holding a Brave Space and I'm using a Brave Space approach, it means that I'm following certain practices that were outlined in the development of this approach. So with this Brave Space approach, the first piece is that we're approaching this work with controversy with civility. So what that means is that this is a space for you to ask questions. This is a space for authentic transformational learning to take place. So varying opinions are welcomed, so long as they honor the rest of the principles. And I really want to say that because we all have the opportunity to learn from each other's opinions, each other's honest opinions. And so I really want to highlight that. The second is owning intentions and impacts. So again, I do anti-racist work with a restorative practice because I believe that they're very much aligned with one another. With restorative practices, we first have to take accountability and acknowledge harm. Those are those first steps. And owning intention and impacts in a Brave Space require us that despite our intentions, we need to acknowledge the impact of our actions, the impact of our behaviors, the impact of our decisions. We need to recognize that and take accountability for the impact despite our intentions. That's what a brave space requires us to do. And that's what an anti-racist space requires us to do. And that's what a restorative space, practice space requires us to do. So we're really looking at impacts here. Challenge by choice. So that's really where we get into this continuing the discussion survey. So if you're not comfortable sharing, and if you're not comfortable challenging in front of everyone, being able to go here and share your responses is really important in challenging by choice. But then also no one's ever forced to speak. Respect, so respect for everyone's basic personhood. That's pretty straightforward, and we're going to talk about respect in just a second. And then no attacks. What I mean by no attacks is that it's useful to everyone if through a process of sharing you identify what were the attitudes at play, what were the beliefs at play, what were the absence of, where was there absent policies or supports that could have supported the situation or made it better. What policies were in place or supports that were in place that caused the conflict to happen, that caused the situation to happen. To focus on what was happening and what was at play, because that makes it relevant to all of us. When you're able to think through what about that situation made it happen, and what about that situation could have been repeated in other situations by other people. So to really focus on the context and what was at play versus focusing on the individual and naming them and attacking them for those actions. So that's what I'm asking you to do today. Now we've gotten to the first kind of piece for today, the first kind of engagement piece. And as you're responding, Michelle, I'm going to try to make sure that the survey link is connected right. And if anyone else is having struggles connecting to that survey, please let me know. But I'm going to ask you to share in the chat, what do you need to feel respected? So this is an important question. This is a question that we often open our spaces with. This is a question that is important to reflect on for yourself and is important in establishing equitable spaces. And if you're interested in seeing more about kind of why we ask this, we've created this post that really outlines why we ask you to vocalize and assert how you need to be respected. Because again, this is important to create equitable spaces. This is important for proactive conflict mitigation. So I encourage you to think and bring this back to your spaces because again, respect is so culturally informed and really looks different for everyone. And being able to talk about this with your team, with your partner, with your family, and having an intentional conversation about what does respect look like to you, you're able to avoid conflict and misunderstanding, or at least establish accountability in understanding each other's respect. It causes us to reflect on privilege. So are you usually in spaces where you feel respected by default? Because it may be harder for you to think about this than someone who is constantly in spaces that they do not feel respected and have thought about a lot in terms of what they actually needed in that time or what could have helped. So it causes us to reflect on privilege. And it creates space that often isn't created in Western professionalism. To talk about feelings, to talk about these culturally informed boundaries and needs. And so this is why we ask this, and this is why we encourage you to take this kind of question back to your teams, back to your spaces, back to your lives, because it's quite a transformative question, and it creates the opportunity to really do this work and to move forward with relationships and to start in good places with relationships. So I'm seeing in the chat some really great responses. Again, I don't have time to go over all of them, but I'm reading them now and acknowledging this as a facilitator of this space. But I also encourage you to think more deeply about what space or respect looks like to you in the future. And again, I'll share this link because we also include some reflection questions, some examples of what we've heard from others, and then how you can reflect on this further. So I'm going to share this link in the chat. And then there's that link. All right. So exploring the racist impacts of bias in the environmental sector. So this is going to be the first section that we explore, and we're gonna have 2 discussion questions in this piece. And really, I want to situate our conversation within a rationale and understanding what can racism and systemic privileging look like in the environmental sector. And I'm going to talk about this at a higher level in terms of policy, in terms of people's bias and how it may inform that policy and that work, and how we can see racism play out through unchecked bias or perceived objectivity. And then I'm going to bring the discussion down to a bit more of an individual level and understanding how our personal biases are created, where it's lived, and how when we don't understand this, when we don't understand our own perspectives, privileges, and identities, how that can translate into racist impacts and barriers that disproportionately impact racialized groups, Indigenous groups, Black groups. And so that's what we're really going to focus on in this first piece. In the later part of our discussion, we're going to focus on moving on. So we're going to focus on talking about equity, and we're going to focus on talking about anti-racism as concepts, and then discussing where are the opportunities to enact this. So let's first explore the racist impacts of bias in the environmental sector. So this section, I'm going to be speaking to some research and experience that I've had in Northern Canada, actually, in Yukon specifically. And I share this, and I want to be clear that I'm not presenting this as an expert on all things Northern or even on this case study. But during my time that I've spent, especially over the past couple years in the North, in engaging with community and elders there, there's a huge division in Canada, particularly in sustainability work, of Southern Canada and Northern Canada. Northern Canada is often left out of our policy discussions, is often left out of our considerations for solutions, for indicators, for success. And in spending time there, I was explained that in being gifted the many stories we were provided during my time there, that we carry those responsibilities to share these stories, to share this leadership, to share these realities with people who listen to us, with the understanding that more people need to understand and look to the North as being a part of this nation, but then also in understanding that there's a wealth of knowledge there that we can be allowing us, that we can allow to inform what we're doing down here. So the case study I want to bring up and highlight, especially with regards to scientific objectivity, which we often rely so heavily on in the sustainability work and sustainability sector, is an experience, is reality that's taken place in Yukon. And so it starts with speaking to this woman. I first met Robin Bradash, who's a member of the Kluane First Nation and Director of Governance for Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs in Yukon. And I met her in the summer of 2019 in Whitehorse, where she presented and discussed her role in laying the groundwork for a project called Healing Broken Connections. And I was really inspired by her work. And shortly after, I was writing an article for the Canadian Science Policy Centre. And I chose to write my article on her and the work that she's done. And so I interviewed her after. And a lot of the information that's shared here is from and directed from that interview. And so when she presented to us at Action Canada during the fellowship study tour in Yukon, she presented this situation, this event that happened. That in 1948, the Champagne-Anishik First Nations and the Kluane First Nation experienced a very violent separation from their traditional lands when it was designated as Kluane Game Sanctuary. So a whole bunch of government scientists and policymakers designated their traditional territory as a game sanctuary, and in doing so, prevented any hunting or gathering from taking place on this land. And so these peoples were violently separated in that they were forcibly removed. It was, from what was shared, a very traumatic and process that happened over many years. And there was a separation of tradition, of land, of necessity-based hunting. It was a very traumatic experience for these peoples. And even though in 1972, so in 1948, it was designated as a game sanctuary. In 1972, they renamed it and restated it as a national park reserve. So in technicality, hunting and harvesting rights were returned to these First Nations. But what they found is that because of that trauma, because of the loss and interruption of connection to land, stories, teachings, language, the people weren't returning back to harvest and hunt. Those relationships with land had been broken. The relationship with the government and national park staff and institutions was completely severed. And so in 2004, after some work in establishing an agreement for a co-management regime, where the park would work with the nations to manage the park, when they put that in place, they also recognized we need to repair these relationships. We need to understand the truth. We need to take accountability, and we need to identify how to move forward. And so in 2004, that's when they really started the Healing Broken Connections project. So in terms of the Healing Broken Connections project, this really included cultural camps, workshops, on the land retreats and trips. And in terms of its impact, I want to highlight Roberta Nakuchi's master's thesis, where through 120 some pages, she explores in detail the Healing Broken Connections project, the impact that happened when they designated the game sanctuary as is. And she explores the impact. And her conclusion after spending a lot of time with community in the nations was that the project strengthened the partners' nation-to-nation relationship, began a healing process between people and land inherent to the park's management priorities, but also identified key factors that need addressing in order to healing to continue. So this project had a lot of impact in terms of moving forward. You saw very cool things coming out of this project. So you saw that in the co-management regime and out of the indicators of environmental integrity that came out of this project, that came out of these relationships repairing, was, for example, an indicator of cultural reintegration, where how they assess the park's health is informed by how well the First Nations have returned back and integrated back into their traditional territories. cultural reintegration as an indicator. It's absolutely phenomenal. If you want to know more about this situation, if you want to know more, especially about that interview, I can share the link in the chat to the article I wrote on this and the cited master's thesis that informed a lot of this writing. But I want to highlight a couple things from this interview. This is what Robin said when I asked, what do you wish more environmental scientists and policymakers knew, more people in the sustainability sector know about Indigenous knowledge and the responsibility to reconciliation? And she said, and she shared an experience when she was in Banff in a sustainability space. And when they were doing this work with the Healing Broken Connections project. And she says, we were talking about reintroducing First Nations to the peoples to the park. And it was so frustrating to me that the scientists were not able to recognize that people had been removed, and that had had an impact. Not only an impact on the land, but an impact on the people. There was such a lack of understanding around the true connection to Indigenous that Indigenous peoples have with the land. This was an interesting statement because here she's expressing a very well-based frustration. This idea that, one, Indigenous people were there before and had existed in this ecosystem for millennia, and not understanding that that had had an impact. And it did have an impact because if you looked at, for example, Roberta explores and notes research around the wolf population when the peoples were removed. When the First Nations were removed, an imbalance in the ecosystem was triggered where now that there wasn't necessity-based hunting, you saw an overpopulation of another dominant predator, the wolf, completely imbalance the ecosystem within that park because these humans were removed, because these First Nations were removed. And that gets to the point, and looking at what was the thinking behind this, creating this game sanctuary in the first place? What is the resistance to First Nations people returning to the land? And if we get to the root of it, if we get to, and in discussion with Roberta, if we look at why these scientists were not able to recognize that people had been removed, that there was an impact, it had a lot to do with their sense of objectivity. Their idea that Western science, their idea that wilderness, their idea that those concepts, that those policies were unbiased and not culturally informed, prevented them from seeing other ways of knowing. So, for example, with regards to this wolf population, this happened because with the scientists, with the policymakers that created the game sanctuary and the policies that associated with it, they did so with the understanding that humans have to be separate from the ecosystem, that humans are above an ecosystem. So if we look at maybe an ecosystem, humans are above it. We are not a part of the ecosystem. Therefore, we have to be separate from it in order to protect it. That's one cultural way of knowing, but oftentimes it's understood as unbiased and objective. If we looked at what coincided with the First Nations people and their understanding of ecosystems and relationships, you would see a chart where a human is within the ecosystem, as part of the ecosystem. And that to remove humans would cause an imbalance in that ecosystem. This worldview is coming with understanding that we honor and respect that relationship, which often doesn't coincide with other cultures, but that we do that. So there's these cultural worldviews, So to understand that one is unbiased is to see the other cultural view of understanding our relationship to ecosystems, our relationship to nature, as bias. And the impact of that in this situation was overpopulation of wolves, and not understanding that that was a possibility, not even thinking that it could have been a possibility. Another piece and another thing that was so frustrating and that really led to this frustration, and why it's so dangerous, is that this idea even of wilderness, let's stick with this idea of wilderness. This idea of wilderness as humans being separate from nature, as land being nobody's land, as in no humans can be on that land, is very dangerous. It's been used throughout the world, this argument of wilderness, this argument of humans being separate from it, this argument that it's nobody's land. This argument has been used to displace Indigenous peoples around the world. It has been used to exploit natural resources. It has been used to accumulate that land and resource. And this approach to wilderness, as innocent as it may be to understand wilderness as humans as separate from nature, the impact of that understanding, the impact of thinking that that cultural view of wilderness is unbiased, has been the displacement from land. And understanding that that is cultural genocide, because our livelihood, our education, our stories, our spirituality, our languages, and our ancestry are so deeply connected to that land. And so to violently remove people from that land, it's such a deeply inflicted trauma. So we trace here this idea that, one, wilderness is nobody's land, and humans have to be separate from nature in order for it to be wild. Understanding that as being unbiased and true, and not checking the fact that that is in fact a biased way of understanding human relationship to land. Without checking that bias, without understanding that that in itself is a non-objective way of looking at nature in relationship to land. You saw a very racist impact where they were devaluing Indigenous knowledge, where they were devaluing an understanding of relationship to land, where they were devaluing the value that Indigenous knowledge provides. And because they devalued all of that, because they moved forward on a perceived unbiased and objective way of knowing, they displaced and they justified the displacement of Indigenous peoples from those lands with very racist impacts on people, but then also negative impacts on the ecosystems. And so I want to highlight here that when we're talking about what systemic or what racism can look like, what systemic privileging can look like, in this case, I've illustrated how a cultural understanding of nature, of relationship to nature, was privileged with this guise of objectivity, with this guise of being unbiased. And because of that, you saw racist impacts. And so if we think about this idea of systemic privileging even, and if we think about really the dominance of whiteness and white scientists in sustainability, in sustainability work, especially in what is currently Canada. We have to think of what is the impact of privileging scientific voices over Indigenous traditional knowledge keepers, over Indigenous ways of knowing. What happens when we're privileging one cultural worldview as being unbiased and all of the others as having bias? And I think that it's so important to recognize in this session, we weren't able to go into systemic racism and the history of race as a social construct. I would have loved to go through all of that, but we didn't have the time to do that today. But it's important to reflect on how the dominance of whiteness and sustainability is a symptom, it's a consequence of things we're doing, of things that have been done through policies, through behaviors, through ideas. And that this is happening in multiple spaces of our lives, and that what we're seeing now is a consequence of what's happening. And if we think of this idea of systemic privileging and the racist impacts it can have, I try to walk through that here with this case study, and how often a worldview that is associated with Euro-Canadian culture and world and understandings and ways of being, understanding the impact that happens, the impact that can come from the understanding that, again, certain views and certain cultural understandings are biased and certain aren't. So this brings me to our first discussion question. And again, I want to highlight that there is the survey. So if you're not comfortable sharing now, please share in the survey. And the question is, have you taken efforts to address incidents of racism or the dominance of whiteness in Waterloo Region's environmental and sustainability community? And what was that experience like? What was the impact? So as you're reflecting on this question, I want to highlight that, I can put this in the chat. I want you to reflect on this question. And in the event description, we ask that you kind of reflect on these questions in advance. But if you're just seeing this question for the first time, to reflect on your own experiences like Robin Bradash, where she was advocating for the recognition and respect of Indigenous worldviews, of Indigenous ways of knowing, and the resistance she got. The resistance she got to confronting that, to sharing even another way of knowing, to confronting the dominance of whiteness in that space, which we spoke a bit about in our interview. For her, that experience was very frustrating. But the impact of doing that was that she overcame that frustration in that situation. And she was able to identify that is causing a barrier for people to understand how we can be moving forward in good ways. And she targeted that work when she went back. And you saw that work and her community's work in understanding that this is a learning barrier for people to overcome, is that they targeted that barrier. And then you see the birth of this idea of cultural reintegration, where they found a language, they found an approach that made sense. They did the work of supporting those who needed to understand why it was important. And the impact of that was a very innovative way of assessing environmental integrity. So I also want to highlight that in advance of this, you were asked to watch this video, whiteness and white fragility. And this video really discusses this idea of whiteness. So if you're struggling with understanding the dominance of whiteness as a topic or as a concept, I encourage you to go to this video that was asked to be watched. And this is a training excerpt from from a training we've done with a client. So I encourage you that if you're struggling with that concept, to check out. These are sometimes uncomfortable conversations. And big piece to this, and I learned this in my mediation training, is that you can practice having difficult conversation. You can practice the skills that can help you navigate difficult conversations. To understand that the ability to confront racism, the ability to confront problematic views, the ability to talk about racism a racist impact that someone had, that's a skill you can develop by practicing it. There are plenty of tools, and even just, for example, all lives mattering issues. If you are confronted with someone who has this perspective of all lives matter, and you don't agree with it and you want to talk about it, then there are things that you can do, especially if you're finding that you're confronting that a lot in a lot of the work that you're doing. There's a way that you can search up articles. How do you confront this? How do other people confront this? Watching videos. And then practicing it with your friends, practicing it with yourself, writing it out. Sometimes when I come home from a frustrating family dinner, say one of my in-laws said something just horribly racist. And in that moment, I didn't choose to gift the labor of explaining where a couple of their misconceptions were. I didn't choose to invest that energy in confronting that situation in that moment. But I still practice that response in my position and in understanding my position in the car ride home, debriefing with my partner why I was so triggered by that, why it was such a problem that someone said that, what it wasn't taking into consideration. And through that practicing, I'm realizing, one, my position, but two, where is information where are my gaps in information? Like, I want to say this, but I want to be able to say this by backing it up with an example or backing it up with some research. I want to be able to come at this with an informed perspective. So if I'm in my process of explaining to my partner why what someone said was such a problem, I'm going to say, I don't know how to articulate this well enough yet. I'm going to do some more research, and then I'm going to try this again. And this practice of having difficult conversations, this practice of confronting racist perspective, racist tones, and these ideas and beliefs that have racist impacts, then you're in a better position to go into those conversations with an informed perspective in a way that allows us to move forward and seek to understand, one, what the other person is saying. Because when we become more confident in our own positions, we're in a place where we can listen and not necessarily listen to respond. Because we're going to respond in different ways when we're first listening to listen, then reflecting on a response, and then responding. This comes with practice. And so I wanted to share that as kind of a closing point to this question. I really appreciate everyone who's sharing in the chat, because this is going to be captured in the summary document. But I want to move on to the next question with regards to this. Have you been made to feel like you don't belong in Waterloo's region environmental and sustainability community? And what was the impact? And here again, I want you to please include stars when you want to speak in the chat. And I'd really appreciate hearing from those who really felt like, who in situations where they haven't felt like they belonged in Waterloo's environmental and sustainability community. And what was the impact? I think it's really important to name this. There's been a lot of instances, especially with my focus in sustainability, it's very much been in energy. And there have been lots of instances where I've gone into energy spaces, where I've gone into sustainability spaces, and through the lack of any diversity on speaker panels, through the audience members and who was invited, through microaggressions, and I say micro with parentheses around micro, because microaggressions are straight up aggressive, but the language is microaggressive aggressions. There are a lot of different things that have made me feel that I don't belong in a space, especially with regards to sustainability. And early on, that impact was to avoid those spaces because of how traumatizing that can be. And in avoiding those spaces, and if this is happening again and again and again to people who don't feel respected, who don't feel reflected in these spaces, when they go to engage and they find time and time again that they aren't respected, that they aren't reflected, you often see either they avoid the spaces or they create spaces for themselves that they do feel respected. And that's very much been the case with Future Ancestors Services. But that there's impact, and oftentimes impact is a loss of our voices. But sometimes impact is acts of resilience and acts of power. And so I'm interested in hearing a couple examples, and I'm happy to see that the survey is filling up. But I want to talk a bit about moving forward. And again, we have a really rushed time today. And so we're gonna talk about moving forward, because I do want to create some space to think more positively about what can we do after this facilitated dialogue. I want to caution this idea of moving forward by saying first that we have not talked about the problem enough. And that my idea by sharing these, but not going too much into detail the way I would normally like to, is to at least start these questions, to start these conversations amongst through critical self-reflection and through your teams. So while I recognize we're not delving into any of these questions in too much detail, I really want you to take away these kind of questions to reflect on your own experiences, but then also to provide space in other parts of your lives for people to share these responses to these questions as well. So I want to go to the moving forward section with the caution that I don't feel that we have in any way spent enough time on talking about the problem. But I do want to leave you with some pretty tangible things in terms of language and conceptual understanding. And then we'll close off the last 10 minutes with a discussion of the final piece. So feel free to turn off your videos at this point. It's going to be some more content discussion. And I'll go on to this next section around moving forward. I'm going to talk about anti-racism. And I'm going to talk about anti-racism in the context of equality, equity, in terms of what we're working towards with this idea of anti-racism, in terms of what it is not, and then in terms of what it can be. And I think this is important to share because, one, we don't want to be using anti-racism in the wrong way. Two, it's a very complex approach. And so this approach to explaining it is very much informed by my own personal journey of taking a long time to understand the full scope of anti-racism and really what it is. But then also in addressing and providing a language, because many of you are likely already doing anti-racism work, but are calling it something else. So I'm going to provide some language and some supports for you to realize maybe how you can frame your work with anti-racism, or how you would like to move forward in further understanding this approach. So that's really what I'm looking to do in this next section. So I'm going to start with what we're working towards with anti-racism. Before defining what it can be, I want to start with what are we going towards? What is this vision that we have? So with anti-racism as an approach, ultimately, we're working towards systemic barrier removal. As an approach, this is what we have to be working towards. And often equity is a way that we're going to get to that systemic barrier removal. And oftentimes, and many of you may have seen a chart where it's equality and equity and understanding the differences between them. But many of those charts are missing the most important part, which is equity is not the end goal. We don't always want to be treating people differently in this way. We're moving and we're working towards systemic barrier removal. So I'm going to walk through this chart really quickly. Equality. So with equality, there's an assumption that everyone will benefit from the same kind of support. They're being treated equally. What happens with equality is that we're not taking into consideration anything outside of the space we're creating. So we're not taking into consideration the barriers that someone may have overcome in order to get to this space that others may have not had to do. It may be not considering different people's abilities within one space. So treating everyone equally would be giving everyone 60 minutes to do a test. No more, no less, no matter who is writing that test. If someone has a learning disability, that's too bad. Everyone has an equal opportunity to write this test. 60 minutes, that is it. That's when everyone's being treated equally. Everyone's given the same supports, same time, same policies, same rules. Everyone's being treated equally. But what happens with equality in racist societies and the realities that we all know today is that when you're giving the same support to everyone without considering, again, the barriers, the experiences, the identities that they're coming with, you're going to have the same supports, but you're going to have an unequal outcome. And that's what we see here with these people trying to look over the fence. Everyone's given the same block. Some people can see over the fence fine, some maybe a little fuzzy, and then some just absolutely cannot see. So here we're giving equal supports, but we're having an unequal outcome. And this is why equality cannot be conflated with equity. Because with equity work, it's done with the understanding that by offering different kinds of supports, by offering different opportunities, by reserving different spots, by doing things which is technically unequal, by implementing unequal supports, unequal rules in technicality, we're doing so with the intention of having more equal outcomes. So with regards to the test, it may be all students have 60 minutes, but if you come forward in advance and identify that you have a learning disability, we can double that time for you. That's an equitable approach. With equity, you often see quotas as well. So say University of Toronto wants to bring in 10 Black faculty, and they reserve 10 spots for Black faculty. That is an equity mechanism. But there is a spectrum of degrees of success with an equity mechanism. So let's follow this hypothetical example with the university and 10 Black faculty. There's a couple things that they're going to do, and they need to do in order for it to be a good equity mechanism. The first is that it's going to explain its rationale for why it's being put in place. So yes, we have reserved 10 spots for 10 Black faculty. But we have to also explain to the community why we're doing that. It's not enough to say, we just want 10 Black faculty. There needs to come to this work and to this equity mechanism with the understanding in that what has to happen is that we need to name the deficit. So we need to name the problem. In this case, the fact that we have no Black faculty. So that needs to be named. But then also it needs to be recognized, and there needs to be an explanation of why bringing in or reserving spots for Black faculty is needed. And oftentimes that requires us to frame an equity mechanism, specifically with a quota, as understanding someone's lived experience as navigating society as a Black person, as pursuing research, as pursuing experiences that have led them to be informed about perspectives, realities in their communities, that they are coming to this job with that lived experience as qualifying them to do it differently, to do their job differently. Just as we're looking for, say, an environmental scientist to come and teach more environmental courses, and we recognize that their experience in exploring environmental science and studying environmental science is going to allow them to do the job differently and with a certain expertise and a certain perspective. Just as we expect that to happen, we are bringing in Black faculty with the understanding that their lived experience as navigating society as a Black person, and through their commitment and their content and their experience in being connected to that community and understanding that population to the degree that they wanted to and to the degree that they have, that they're coming to this job being able to do work differently. They're coming to this job being able to relate to students in a different way and representing something different to them. And that is going to have an outcome on their work outputs. That's going to have an outcome on the faculty outputs. And so we recognize that we don't have that expertise right now, and we need to put in place, and when we don't have that expertise right now, and there are things in our policy, there are issues in our hiring processes, there are reasons why we don't have that representation now. And we need to understand that and work towards it. So in the meantime, we need to reserve these spots because we still recognize that they're bringing in a qualification to do this job differently. So an equity mechanism is going to provide that rationale, because if they don't, and we see this, we're working with several federal ministries right now, and one in particular have brought Black employees specifically in closer proximity to ministers through advising roles. And what they're seeing right now is that many of their colleagues aren't treating them with respect because they think that they got a free ride, because they think that they don't belong there. And that's a failure on the equity mechanism for not explaining to their colleagues, for not situating the action of bringing Black people into these advising roles as understanding that they are filling deficits within that space and within those roles, but that they are also bringing a qualification just like any other credential that we assign in a more professional Western setting. So a good equity mechanism is going to explain the rationale, and it's going to explain the context for why this equity mechanism is being put in place. The second thing it's going to do is it's going to be established with the understanding that it will not exist. It will eventually not exist. In that we don't always want to have equity. We don't always want to have a quota. So we're going to put this quota in place for, say, 5 years until we can build the internal capacity, the internal diversity to fundamentally change the organization where our policies, where our processes, our supports, create space where we honor diverse ways of knowing and diverse people at the entry level of our organization, but that when we bring them in, they're being brought into actively anti-racist, inclusive spaces. So we're going to go through a holistic organizational change. We're going to develop, or we have an evaluation process in place, so that our goal is in 5 years, we don't need this quota because we have changed the organization to a point where we honor these diverse people. Because not every organization needs a quota. We don't always need quotas. Some organizations have this down pat. I see a lot of Indigenous-led, Black-led organizations that are doing this work really well, that honor people through their processes and how it was fundamentally created. You don't need quotas, but in many instances, organizations do need them in order to get to a place where they don't need them. So that is what a good equity mechanism is going to do. It's going to be put in place with the understanding that it will not always exist. And that through the process of creating an organization where you don't need a quota, you are removing the systemic barriers within the organization, within the policies and procedures, but that you're also positioning the organization to better respond to racism and barriers that are happening outside of the organization, but that impact people before and after they come to that space. And so that's really what a good equity mechanism is going to do, is that it is going to work towards systemic barrier removal, which is what we're doing in anti-racism work. Now, in terms of anti-racism work, it cannot be interchangeably used with multiculturalism and diversity and inclusion. With multiculturalism, we're celebrating the positive aspects of society, of different cultures, of diverse cultures, which is great. But many people are going to be skeptical about this, especially in history of its application as an organizational approach, as a policy approach, in that it focuses on bringing excluded groups into the dominant identity, into the dominant culture. So with multiculturalism in Canada, it's really focused on bringing excluded groups, non-white Canadians, into this Canadian identity. And if we want to think about what is Canadian identity really telling us, we can look to Tim Hortons, we can look to Canadian Tire, we can look to all of these different Canadian branding things, identities. We can look into how we're presented in media. We can look to all of these different things to understand that Canadian identity has become defined, and through history, I'd love to go into the history, but I can't right now, but that through history, Canadian identity has been defined in a very narrow way. And what multiculturalism has done as a policy and as a program in its application has been to bring these excluded groups into a culture, into identity that was defined through a racialized lens, that was defined through a single cultural lens. So we're not doing anti-racism when we're doing multiculturalism. There are instances where celebrating the positive aspects of diverse cultures is so important, and where it's educational. But as an organizational approach, as the only organizational approach, as the only approach that we do our work in only celebrating the positive aspects, we cannot overcome the barriers that are in place and being experienced right now. So multiculturalism cannot be used interchangeably with anti-racism. Diversity and inclusion can, even though we may use diversity and inclusion in order to achieve anti-racism, we can do diversity and inclusion without being anti-racist. So for example, one of the fellowship programs I was a part of, most diverse cohort they've ever had. They brought us in and they included us. But because they hadn't done the work in identifying what kind of space are we engaging them in and on whose terms are we doing this engaging, we were diverse and we were being included, but we were being included in a space where there were all white coordinators, all white mentors, and all white speakers. So there was conflict that arose when we would challenge these experiences, when we would challenge the issues that we were being faced with, when we had to advocate and we had to confront consistently racist perspectives and truths that were being presented as the only truths. And so in that instance, I really saw how diversity and inclusion can happen where you see, oh, we have an absence of diverse people. Let's just throw on some diversity efforts. Let's put on a quota. Let's do all of these things. And in this case, seeing a couple symptoms of an illness and throwing medication at it. And doing this, you're missing the bigger picture. But then also, in the case of the fellowship, we were brought into toxic spaces, and there was an issue with retention, and we didn't leverage the power of that diversity. With anti-racism, you see some symptoms, but before diagnosing the illness, before throwing medication at it and treatments at it, you're going to look around for other symptoms. You're going to look and see, why are we seeing those symptoms? What about lifestyle? What about diet? What about all of these things are leading to these systems? What about family history are leading to these systems, these symptoms? We're looking to have a deep understanding of the symptoms we're seeing. And when we have an understanding and a fuller picture of what's happening, then we're going to prescribe medications that are informed by the scope of the symptoms we're seeing. But we're also going to prescribe treatments in a preventative way, where we aren't seeing these symptoms arise again, or where we can prescribe another medication when we see these symptoms arise again. That's what anti-racism is doing. We seek to understand the problem. We seek to acknowledge harm and take accountability before proceeding with building relationships, before proceeding with throwing diversity and inclusion efforts at it. So oftentimes I see people doing anti-racist work, but calling it diversity and inclusion, because they've done really complex work in understanding what's the problem and then moving forward with solutions. And in doing so, followed the principles of anti-racism. My biggest concern is when people are doing diversity and inclusion work, but calling anti-racist work. That is grossly inappropriate to do. Because in anti-racism, we are required to talk about racism. We are required to talk about the problem before moving on with the solutions. And so for the next 10 minutes, sorry, Kent. I'm going to aim to spend about 8 minutes on this section. We may not get to this point in the full detail that I would love to. I will stay on for an extra 10 minutes after our time together. But I think it's really important to explain anti-racism as an approach. So I want you to reflect, and I'll share this question in the chat so that you can think about it as we're going through this next section, as I'm explaining anti-racism as an approach. And again, I want you to either share your response in the survey, share the response in the survey, share it in the chat. I'll give about 5 minutes after I'm done explaining anti-racism to talk about this. And then I'll stay on for about 10 minutes after past our scheduled time, if the discussion goes further. But I really want to explain anti-racism as an approach, because it is a beautiful and complex approach, in that it does especially 4 things. Now, there are many visions of what anti-racism approach can be, and there's no one book explaining this is the anti-racist approach, and the only one. No one has final say on really what it is, because I've seen many different definitions of anti-racism. This definition is a compilation of many in terms of this is what many anti-racism approaches consistently require us to do. So first, it requires us to center racism. So we need to talk about it, we need to name it, and we need to seek to understand it. So that's one point that we're doing with anti-racism work. It's not enough to all of a sudden decide to diversify the cohort. before diversifying the cohort, the fellowship cohort, we're going to go through the work of assessing what kind of space are we bringing them into, and what do we have in place that prevented diverse people from successfully joining the cohort in the first place? Why do we need to implement these diversity and inclusion efforts? Why do we even need to do that in the first place? So that's what we're doing and starting with anti-racism. And this follows, again, a restorative practice approach. Then we're applying an intersectional lens. I didn't want to use anti-racism for the longest time because I thought it only focused on race. And I was like, I want to talk about gender. I want to talk about language. I want to talk about age. I want to talk about ability. I don't want to just talk about race. And that is a huge misconception about anti-racism, because it is intersectional, in that we are going to talk about race, but we are going to talk about race at the intersection of other identities. So this requires us to not only look at a quota and how we're trying to maybe bring more women into the workforce, and where maybe we have 50% women at the workplace. That's great. And efforts to do that is great. But with an anti-racist lens, we're also required to look at, okay, we brought in all this women, but let's disaggregate that data. Let's look at what kind of women are we bringing into this space? Are we benefiting only one kind of woman through our equity efforts? It's not enough to say we have 50% women. What kind of women? How diverse are those women being brought in? And often you'll find, especially in the sustainability sector, that those efforts to bring in more women, especially, and I see so much emphasis placed on gender, which is important. But, and yes, slides will be available, Deborah, after the presentation. You see that and that being claimed as the epitome of diversity. But if you break it down and you go down by race, if you go down by age, if you go down by disability, ability, if you go down by languages spoken, you're going to see that it's actually not that diverse. And that we aren't actually benefiting the people we're seeking to benefit in terms of diversity through this equity mechanism. So it is intersectional. It requires us to assess our efforts with an intersectional lens of not only looking at one identity marker. We have to look at more than one. This is important, especially when we're working in marginalized communities, equity-seeking communities. Say we're looking to implement a program that targets people with disabilities. It's one thing to target people with disabilities and to support them, but we need to assess, we need to create that support with the understanding that people with disabilities are going to be coming with other intersections of identities. A Black disabled person, an Indigenous disabled person, is not only overcoming barriers in terms of their disability, but they're overcoming barriers because of their race as well. We need to develop our program, we need to develop our assessment criteria to assess how well are we serving those disabled people. If we're claiming to serve all disabled people, we need to assess our success in doing that. We need to apply that intersectional lens. It addresses power in that we're talking about power as well. It's not enough to say we have 60% racialized people in the Ontario government, say, for example. We dealt with this kind of data a lot at the Anti-Racism Directorate, where we said we would look at stats like that. Say 60% of employees are racialized, Black and Indigenous. But if you, and that sounds great, but if you add a lens of power in terms of where are they situated in the power structure of the organization, more often than not, in many spaces that claim to have a lot of diversity, you're going to see a drop. You're going to see racialized people in representation in a lot of admin roles, intern, student positions, advisor roles, low power positions in the structure. Once you hit maybe middle management, you see a sharp decline. And you see that this decline hits 0 before you hit the end of that power structure. So with an anti-racist lens, we're not only looking at how diverse we are, we're not only looking at this intersection of identities, we're also looking at who has power in these spaces. We're asking questions about who is making decisions about resource allocation, about policies, about who is included and who is not. So we're addressing power. And then it is proactive. And that we're not only looking to respond to racism, but we're looking to create spaces through policies, through attitude shifting, through education. We're looking to be proactive in preventing racism from impacting our space, or when racism does happen within our space, we have supports in place, we have training in place, we have capacity to deal with that conflict in safe and supportive ways. It is proactive. So how we're applying all of this is through this beautiful duality of individual approaches and systemic approaches. And we need both in order to truly be anti-racist. We need to do this work for ourselves and through our way of being, in terms of confronting racism, in terms of checking our own bias, in terms of critically self-reflecting on our own power and privilege and how it informs our perspectives and experiences. We need to seek to understand systemic racism, to understand racism. But then we also need to be applying that capacity and that learning to how we work with systems, to how we organize an organization, an event, communication. And so anti-racism is unique in that not many approaches you can write on paper and use as a lens to assess a program, assess a support, assess a policy, create a support, create an event. There are not many approaches where you can do that, but then also act it and also let it inform the way you exist. And this is what anti-racism does, which is what gets me so excited about it. And that it can look like so many different things. It could be awareness training like this. It could be complaint procedures. Do we have processes in place where if a race-related conflict especially arises in the workplace, do we have a safe and comprehensive way for someone to deal with that and to bring that to the forefront? Do we have a process that honors people's safety and people's anonymity and pursuing a restorative process and addressing the racism they've experienced or the race-related conflict in the workplace? In terms of communications, who's being represented in our communications? What are we saying about them through nonverbal and verbal cues? Where are we putting these communications? Are they just on email newsletters? Are they just online? Are they just on social media? Are we sharing this information in places where people with no access to internet are able to access them? Especially in spaces and realities and societies where poverty is racialized. And I can share a resource where I spent about 8 months exploring that in the context of Toronto specifically. So anti-racism, there's so many different ways that we can apply it through our work, through what we're doing for systemic and systems approaches, through organizational approaches, through institutional approaches, but that we can also live by. And by doing all of this work, we're working towards that systemic barrier removal. So now that we've talked a bit about anti-racism, and I know we're at the end of our time, but I hope that with a deeper understanding of what anti-racism is, we're better able to start thinking about where the opportunities are to foster anti-racism in the environmental and sustainability community in Waterloo Region, and what our roles and responsibilities are to those opportunities. So I'm going to come back to this question, But for those who have to leave right now, I just want to highlight that again, we have this survey, but that also, I really want to urge you to consider making a small donation to the African Community Wellness Initiative, which is what we're putting towards all of the donations that we're collecting today. If you've benefited from this, especially because this is a free event, because there's a lot of labor, research, and perspective that goes into something like this, I really want to encourage you to going back to the registration page, and I'm going to include it again in the chat, and making a donation if you are able. And you can just go register and you can donate. I will change this setting, but you're able to donate $10, $20, or $50 as many times as you want. And so I really urge you that a few minutes after this session to consider donating to this initiative. And you can read more about what they're doing in the event page. But I really want you to consider that if you're leaving with valuable knowledge today, to consider, instead of paying for a ticket today, contributing to that fund. So thank you very much to everyone who stayed on to this point. I invite you to stay on for 10 minutes for the discussion of the last question. Thank you very much to people who have contributed to the survey. Here's my contact information. I'd encourage you to take a quick screenshot if you need to reach out to me for anything afterwards. Now I'd really like to go to the discussion piece. So if you're interested in staying on, thank you for doing so. In terms of this discussion piece around where are opportunities to foster anti-racism in Waterloo Region's environmental and sustainability communities.